Good morning and welcome to the second of our COP26 live lessons. It's great to have you with us here this morning. Just a couple of things before we get started. Firstly, we'd really love to see your questions. Do get them coming in. You can see up on your screen now how you can get there. So use the live support chat and also via the live Q&A app. I will warn you, the first set of questions will be coming in about 15 minutes time, so don't hold back, especially if you've got questions for Henry and Catherine, who you're about to see. Apart from that, another thing I'd just like to tell you is that you can use the pause and rewind function on the live lesson. So during this lesson, at some points, there's going to be some questions up on the screen. If you need a little bit more time, feel free to pause. These are going to be available on demand as well, almost straight after the lesson. So you will be able to go back, refer to this and see some of the activities you can do. Right, I'm going to send you all the way over to rural Lincolnshire to meet Jenny, who's going to be finding out of some events that happened in 2019.
Hello everyone, I'm here at Short Ferry Farm in Lincolnshire, and today we are going to be exploring some of the causes, the impacts and the responses to the flood that happened here in 2019. We're also going to be considering the same issues that happened on a much larger scale down in the Somerset levels floods of 2014. You're going to be given the opportunity to meet the farmers that were significantly affected by those floods. You're going to have a chance to ask them your questions, and then hopefully you will have an enhanced understanding of the issues around flooding. So let's get started. As you can see on your screen now, this shows the degree of flooding at this farm in November of 2019. Lincolnshire had received more than twice its seasonal average rainfall that year, increasing the discharge of the river. The discharge of a river is defined as the volume of water that streams past a particular point in the river's course every second. When the water levels exceeded the river's capacity, the left bank was breached, leading to flooding of farmland. Henry was concerned that the river hadn't been dredged for over 50 years, and so as a result had reduced capacity to deal with the additional discharge of the river. And the Environment Agency responded that they did maintain the river regularly and that the flood was a result of the increased rainfall. This photograph shows the Short Ferry Caravan Park, which is just over the road from Henry's farm. This was evacuated as the water levels rose. Use of land for development such as this could enhance the flood risk, as the proportion of impermeable surfaces increases and drainage systems are installed. Farming practices in the area will also influence the flood risk. An example of this is the preservation of wetlands and forests to intercept and store water, minimising the flood risk. So now it's time for you to do some thinking. Floods are caused by a combination of human and natural or physical factors. So what I'd like you to do is make a list of all the human and natural or physical factors that we've heard about so far that led to the floods that happened here in Lincolnshire in 2019. So now we're going to go and meet the man himself, Henry Ward, the farmer who was here farming on this farm in 2019 when the flood happened. So we're now here with the man himself. This is Henry Ward. We're here on his farm. So Henry, thank you so much for having us.
No problem.
Can you tell us what it was like in 2019 when your farm flooded?
Yeah, it was a shocking time, to be honest. We obviously had like unprecedented amounts of rain, very wet. The river was absolutely full to the top. And it just kept raining and I was really worried, and then the inevitable happened. We started to get overtopping of the riverbank, so water was gushing over the top, literally just over there. That eroded the back of the bank out and then it just burst, and then within a matter of hours this farm just got completely submerged with water. As far as the eye could see, it was just like an inland sea, and if we were stood here just over 2 years ago today, the water would have been above our heads. It was that deep, and it just came in that fast. So it was just, yeah, quite a shock to see it. I can remember coming down for the first time and looking just after it happened, and it just, I couldn't believe what I was looking at, to be honest. Normally I'm used to seeing these green fields growing crops in, and it was just like a lake. And
so the economic impact must have been huge.
Yeah, so loss of earnings that year came to about £80,000 because we were meant to have a lot of potatoes grown on this land, which is a high value crop. Couldn't get them in, and so Yeah, so we lost that revenue, and then damage to property on the farm, that came to about £30,000, so just over £100,000 lost in that year, and that was my first year on this farm. I only just took it over, so it was not a good start. Pretty disastrous, and I was just wondering how I was going to survive really financially.
Yeah. And so flooding on this sort of scale has a really huge impact on the environment. What have you noticed?
Yeah, so you can probably hear above us the skylarks singing. It's an absolute haven for wildlife down here. Been near the river, it obviously attracts wildlife, and it's great. There's a nature reserve just over across the river there, and it is a haven for wildlife. But of course, we get that flooding. It happens so fast, and not only that, we had water sat on this farm for so long. So it flooded in the 8th of November. And there was still water on the land into February, and so it was just absolutely desolate around here. I can remember standing in the yard when it flooded, and it was just eerily quiet. There was no bird song or anything like that. We lost the barn owls out the shed. They'd gone. We've actually just put an owl box up back in there to try and encourage them back, and we're just starting to see them come back 2 years later, but it's taken that long for it to sort of recover.
Yeah. Oh wow. And so the impact on the soil and on your crops, how long has it taken for that to sort of recover as well?
Yeah, so we're not back to 100% productivity yet. We're getting there, which I didn't know. It was a complete unknown to me. I didn't know how long it was going to take, but we're getting there slowly. So the first year we probably had sort of half the yields or production that we should have had. This last year maybe 75%, and hopefully the coming harvest will be back to normal hopefully. But it's been a huge, it was just the year that we flooded. There's been knock-on effects sort of the last couple of years.
And so there was quite a delay, wasn't there, from when the river initially breached to when it was actually repaired?
Yeah.
What was the reason for that?
Well, for a start, unfortunately, the communication between the Environment Agency and ourselves was poor. For 5 days, we were completely flooded and we heard nothing from them. And I was just pulling my hair out. I didn't know what the plan was. I just, seeing your farm completely cut off from by floodwater, and we hadn't heard anything. I have to say that as we're 2 years down the road, and that's improved greatly, and we've got good communications now and everything else. But so that was for a start. But then it was just a nightmare. So if you imagine the breach was literally just over there, massive hole in the riverbank, totally cut off by floodwater, 6, 7, 8 foot deep. So the logistics of getting materials in to mend the hole, because you couldn't just drive down the riverbank because it could have collapsed. It was so unstable. So we had to have specialist equipment in, boats and pontoons to float equipment over there. It was a nightmare. So it was a massive operation to get it mended. It
sounds huge. And so has this given you, how do you feel about the risk of flooding in the future? What sort of...
So it was only in January, I was on the phone to Catherine from the Environment Agency, worried that we were going to flood again. So only sort of, 18 months on, and I thought we were back in the same position again. And we're going to be seeing this more and more. Climate change is happening. We're getting more and more sort of extreme rainfall events. So I am really concerned, and hopefully projects going forward to improve flood resilience are going to help. But it is a massive concern for me on this farm, definitely.
No, I can understand that. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us, and I do hope your harvest gets back to normal soon. Thank you. So you mentioned Catherine from the Environment Agency. We're really lucky that she is here on the farm today, isn't she? So can we go and meet her?
Yeah, I think she's in the shed just across there, so we'll go and see her, shall we?
Brilliant, let's do that. So thank you, Catherine, for talking to us today. So as a result of climate change, floods like this are going to become more and more frequent, aren't they? So can you tell us a bit more about the flood resilience project that you've put into place as a result of the 2019 flood?
Yes, so I'm the local lead on the Lower Witham Flood Resilience Project. We're looking to update an existing flood risk strategy that was produced in 1997. That used modelling and data and surveys from the time, and now we're looking to try and improve on that and get modern computer models to really sort of assess what's going on here and look at how the landscape has changed over that time. That original strategy recommended reinforcing, repairing some embankments, but also implementing storage areas, so flooding some of the farmland around here to take the pressure off the rest of the embankments. Some of the embankment works were actually able to be funded at the time, but the storage areas never happened. That was partly down to funding and partly down to a lack of willing landowners who would allow their land to be used in that way.
Yeah.
So since the 2019 floods, and we've had changes to our funding rules and the environmental land management scheme, things like that have come along where we can actually pay farmers for having water on their land.
Oh, right. Okay.
We're hoping that all of those things together will allow that storage option to be put in place now and to protect the rest of the really productive farmland that we've got around here and the communities that are in this area.
So how effective do you think these soft engineering approaches are going to be in the future to reduce future flood risks?
I think they are going to be really effective. So floodplains are nature's flood regulators. Unfortunately now we have communities, homes, businesses and productive farmland on these floodplains. So we are going to have to make a choice about whether we use those floodplains to reduce flood risk and where we need to actually still protect those really critical areas. We have a really good example not far from here, just upstream of the city of Lincoln, where the Lincoln washlands protect the city, and they've been doing that since the late 1980s. So water is taken out of the river when the levels get really high, put onto the farmland. There is an arrangement with the farmers, they know it's going to happen, and it holds the water until the danger has passed, the river levels come back down again, and then it can safely be pushed through Lincoln. So we are confident that the same approach would help the lower Witham downstream of Lincoln to be more resilient to climate change and the flood risk that it already has.
So do you think that soft engineering approaches such as this are going to become more popular in the future, or do you think there's always going to be a demand for hard engineering schemes?
I think they will become more popular. There is still a need for hard engineering, and we have an example, another scheme not far from here, the Swayton Natural Flood Management Project, where we've managed to combine soft and hard engineering. So we have attenuation ponds and field swales. The attenuation ponds themselves have hard engineered penstocks and spillways, which make those control features controllable and safe so that they don't erode and cause a problem further downstream. So I think in the future we're going to see a hybrid. We're going to see lots more storage, soft engineering, floodplain reconnection, but we still need that hard engineering to manage that process and protect those areas that we really want to protect. So yes, farmers will get rewarded for storing floodwater on their land. So we hope that will be the final piece in the puzzle to allow us to implement this approach on a wide scale in this area.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Catherine. Thanks so much for explaining all that to us today.
No problem.
So now it's your turn to have another go at another activity. What I'd like you to do is think about some of the social, economic and environmental impacts of the flooding that happened here on Henry's farm in 2019. Off you go.
Wow, that was really insightful. How did you do with the two different questions that Jenny posed? The first question was to make a list of the physical and natural factors that led to the flooding in 2019. Did you give heavy rainfall as an example as a physical factor? You could have used you could use lack of maintenance of the river or the increased impermeable surfaces from the caravan park as human factors. The second question was, what are the social, environmental and economic impacts of the flood at Henry's in 2019? For economic examples, you could point to any of Henry's examples related to money. This included loss of business during the floods and the cost of replacing damaged property. Social aspects could have been related to people, including the stress of coping with the flood and the problems with being cut off from seeing other people. Environmental impacts included the pollution of fresh water and damage to habitats, amongst other issues. So, you've been sending your questions in, and the great news is that I've got Catherine and Henry here now, live from over in Lincolnshire. So thank you so much for joining me, Henry and Catherine. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you.
Yeah, good, thank you.
Lovely. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. So we've had questions coming in all morning. The first question I'd like to put to both of you is, what are you doing to make the local area more resilient to flooding in the future?
Henry,
we'll kick off with you, Henry.
Yeah, I'll start. So in fact, we've got some farmland further upstream near Lincoln, which there's 100 acres we're actually taking out of production. So it's not very good productive land, and we've taken the decision that it's not making us a lot of money actually farming it. So there are schemes available now. It's called a countryside stewardship scheme, a higher level one, and we're actually grassing 100 acres down, and we're putting scrapes and wetland areas in, and that area of land will hold more water, and so it'll hopefully slow the rate of the water when we have high rainfall events getting into the river and take pressure off, off the river system. So we're doing that. So that's what we're sort of doing on a farmer sort of level.
Brilliant. And Catherine, what are you doing from the Environment Agency side of things?
Yeah, so in the video I mentioned the Lower Witham Flood Resilience Project. So that's a much bigger project than we've ever had before in this area. And it's doing exactly what Henry just was just talking about, working with farmers to support them to identify areas where we can actually put flood water to save the areas that we want to protect. So we're at a data gathering stage at the moment. It's going to be a few years of discussions and negotiations and looking at all the evidence to make sure we're putting this storage in the right place. At the same time, we're also looking to try and step up maintenance where we can to improve the flow of water through the water courses. So there's an awful lot going on. And you probably heard about the Environment Agency's flood warning system as well. So that's another tool that we have to make sure people are warned when flooding is about to happen, so they can take measures to protect themselves.
Fantastic, thank you ever so much. One of the other questions we've had come in is asking about the cleanup operation that happened and the repair works. There was a little bit of drone footage in the footage that we had earlier. Can you tell us a little bit more about how actually it came together? What did you do to fix the problem essentially that led to the flooding?
Yeah, so it was a very difficult situation. As Henry said, the breach area was cut off by the river and the flood water. The banks themselves were very wet and we couldn't drive any equipment across the banks. Because it was farmland that was flooded and not a village or a town like we had in the Wainfleet flooding that you may remember, we didn't have the option of using a helicopter to bring in sandbags or anything like that. So we ended up having to wait until the series of storms that we had passed. And then we got our specialist contractors to put some floating plants that floated out across the floodwater up to the breach. And then they had to drive in 12-metre long piles to get down to the firm enough ground to make sure that they were going to be strong enough to fill the breach. Once they were in, that we were able to then pump out the water, which took many, many weeks to get all of that water back off the land and back into the river again. And at that point, once the land had dried out, we were able to finish the repair. So we had to go back in with heavy machinery and build up the banks again around the sheet piling. So it was a long and complicated and quite expensive operation to repair that breach.
Wow, yeah, it sounds like a massive job and obviously a lot of effort going to that and effort ongoing as well. A question for you, Henry, that's come in and it's been upvoted a couple of times on the app. Students are really interested to know about how you think climate change is going to continue to affect your farming operation in the future. How do you see climate change affecting farming?
Yeah, so it's a huge worry for me, especially at Short Ferry Farm. We're going to see it's a case of sort of when and not if we're going to flood again. I think we're seeing this more extreme rainfall events with climate change. It's happening without shadow of a doubt. So it's a huge concern for me there. And then so we've got other land elsewhere, which are higher ground, which doesn't flood. But again, we suffer with the same thing. So we have, when we want to try and plant crops, we have wet, really wet autumns and we struggle to actually plant our crops. And then we have really dry springs and we get droughts and it's a real battle. So as farmers, we're trying to work with Mother Nature to produce food. But at the minute and going forward, it just feels like we're up against it all the time and it is really tough. But we've got to try and find ways
that make us more resilient and try and farm in a more sustainable way. But it's a big challenge, but we've got to take up the mantle and sort of, it's no good sort of hiding from this problem. We've got to do something about it and try and adapt.
Brilliant, thank you, James. And yeah, I can see on the questions as well, some of you have asked about how farming is going towards net zero. We haven't got lots of time to talk about that today, but if you tune back in on Thursday at 11 o'clock, we're going to be doing a lesson all around farming and the carbon cycle. So please do tune in for that. Very quick last question, Henry. It's asking if flooding affects animal farming. We're not going to touch on this a lot now because James, who we're going to see a little bit later, was affected. He's a livestock farmer. But I know there was a poultry farmer affected by this flood as well.
Yeah, so our neighbouring farmer's a big poultry farmer producing chickens, and he was lucky, in fact it's complete coincidence, that his chickens were ready to go to slaughter that the day before the flooding happened. So all his chickens were out of the sheds. What happened is those sheds flooded before they got them mucked out, and all the chicken litter raised up in the water level, and it got stuck between the two layers of the sheeting in the sheds, and it was a biosecurity hazard. And so what they had to do, they had to strip all the sheeting around the sheds off, and it meant that they couldn't restock with chickens in those sheds for about 9 months, and so that had a massive impact on their income.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see now, and it shows how much that flooding actually can affect stuff in the short term, but even things that you might not think about in terms of food production, there's a lot of rules that have got to be adhered to. And it's amazing actually the level of repair efforts that have to go in, not just once the water's gone, but far beyond that and the effects of the flood water coming in. Thank you so much, Henry and Catherine, for joining us this morning. Really appreciate your time.
No problem.
Thank you. Bye.
So as we can see, the Environment Agency and local landowners are working together to improve resilience to flooding in the area. Flood hydrographs provide us with really useful information to review past flood events and prepare for the future. After this lesson, you may want to complete the extension activity that you can see up on the screen now to further examine the flooding at Henry's farm during the storm. The storm hydrographs from this extreme weather event in 2019, really useful, really great bit of data to have a look at. So we've looked at an example of the impacts of flooding on an individual farm and considered what action can be taken to make the farm more resilient in the face of future flooding. Now it's time to turn our attention to a larger scale flood that struck Somerset in 2014. Once again, this flood was caused by record rainfall onto the land in a very flat area, and there are accusations of a lack of maintenance of the rivers as well. Over to Jenny in Somerset.
In 2014, Somerset was hit by record rainfall as a result of depressions or areas of low pressure crossing the county. The resulting rainwater couldn't soak into the already saturated soil, so it had to stay on the surface and eventually ran into the surrounding rivers, such as the River Parrett and the River Tone, both of which had not been dredged in 25 years. In addition to this, the storms also caused storm surges, which means a rise in sea levels, and this affected the amount of water that was in the tidal sections of the rivers. This was flooding on a huge scale. In addition to the 16 farms that had to be evacuated, over 600 homes were flooded, and the estimated cost of the resultant damage was over £10 million. I'm here with James on his farm, and this farm was significantly affected during the floods. So hi James, thank you so much for having us. Can you tell us a bit more about what it was like for you back in 2014?
Well, it was a challenge, to say the least. We started flooding in November/December of 2013, and so we had water on the land, which we've had in the past, and the farm actually in the houses are higher than the land in this area, so we weren't too concerned. Then Christmas came and went, and we had another storm come through, but the water on the land, crucially, hadn't been pumped off, because whenever water comes onto our farm, it has to be pumped back into the river, or the surrounding land. It has to be pumped back into the river, because of the river is a raised water level carrier, so which means it's slightly above the ground. So every drop that comes here has to be pumped in. Now, that hadn't happened because of Christmas and bank holidays, and the Environment Agency hadn't really got on with it. So then we had another storm in January, which topped up. And, you know, they were never getting on top of it, but wouldn't get extra pumps in.
Right.
So, because that's an added cost.
Yeah.
So they said, oh, no, it'll be all right, it'll be all right. It'll, you know, the usual pumps will pump down. They didn't. We had another storm come in. The water rose a metre within 12 to 24 hours.
A metre overnight?
A metre overnight,
wow.
Which was, it was too late. We couldn't get lorries in to evacuate cattle because the roads were all underwater. The farm is higher than the roads. So we then had tractors and trailers, or started.
How many cows were you trying to evacuate?
550.
Wow.
So we started with 2 tractors and trailers and soon realised it wasn't going to.
Yeah. And all the time the water was rising while you were trying to do this on your own?
All the time. You could see it, literally see it rising. So we put a call out on Facebook and Twitter. Also Radio 4 and the BBC were here, and we asked for help, and 16 tractors and trailers turned up. People we didn't even know turned up to help and spend their time moving my cattle. Not only tractors and trailers, people to help load the cattle.
Yeah.
And it was absolutely amazing. In a dark time, it was fantastic just to see people wanting to help, and you weren't on your own.
Yeah. That's really
so
lovely.
we then evacuated the animals to the market, Sedgemoor Market, and Greenslade Taylor Hunt were amazing. They took the animals in and then found locations for them to go, so buildings for them to go to. So we had 9 farms over a 40-mile radius. So 9 farms had my cattle in over a 40-mile radius, which is amazing.
Yeah.
And it took 48 hours to get all my cattle out non-stop.
Gosh, you must have been very tired.
Very tired and wet, because we were getting out and it was up to our waist in water come the finish.
Wow.
We couldn't have got any more out. But you've also got to bear in mind the roads were underwater. We couldn't see the edges of the roads because there's ditches all along the roads. We had to follow telegraph poles because they're always on the edge of a road. So that was the only sort of guidance we had to get out.
To find the road, wow.
Yeah, exactly. So we all did a convoy out, and all the convoy in. You don't meet anybody because you wouldn't know where to pull in.
Yeah.
So once we finished doing that, we then started evacuating my neighbours' cattle. But it soon dawned on me we weren't able to get any food out for the animals.
So you'd lost all of your food store for the
everything.
cows. Wow.
So then we were out of our houses for 11 and a half months. The water was in our houses for 3.5 months. And not only was it just water, it was sewage. All the 2 sewage farms flooded. All the sewage from the houses flooded. There was diesel from cars. We had battery acid from the cars in the village that were flooded. You name it. It was a proper cocktail, which...
Yeah. And this must have been, this was all inside your house as well?
All inside our house. So we had a brown tide line when the water went out with just sludge over everything. And it wasn't just me, it was the whole village. You know, there was a lot of houses underwater. Friends who came to help load cattle onto trailers, in between loading cattle, they would go in and take stuff upstairs. And so, you know, we didn't lose everything, but it wasn't brilliant.
Yeah.
My father had dementia at the time, and we had to have a special ambulance come and take him. Well, it wasn't an ambulance. The Marines came in and took Dad in a boat because they couldn't get the ambulance here. And then he had to stay away, or Mum and Dad stayed at my sister's for 11.5 months.
11.5 months.
Until the house was put back to how it was.
Yeah.
The problem is with dementia, and we found this with many people in the village, the elderly, they didn't come back because it was such a shock, such a change. Everything needs to be kept the same.
Yeah.
Dad did come back, but not unfortunately as Dad. Dad had he couldn't eat, he couldn't talk. It wasn't Dad.
What was the impact on the farm and on the land and on the wildlife?
Well, as the water went down, there's high ridges around all the fields, and like a bank, and we were picking up dead animals, you know, hares, rabbit, snakes, badgers, foxes, deer, barn owls. Barn owls couldn't survive. They're very territorial.
Yeah.
And because it was such a vast area flooded,
Yeah.
all the rodents had perished that they would have eaten.
Yeah.
And so they were dying, you know, and because some of the water was very toxic,
Yeah.
we had eels and fish dead. So it was, and then worms also. We had tens of thousands of worms. You know, it smelt. Everything was rotting.
Yeah.
And stank.
Yeah.
All the grass was dead. It was very barren and so depressing.
Yeah.
We had debris all over the place. Rainbow silage had floated here. Trees had uprooted and floated. Garden fences. Kids' play toys, you know, plastic toys.
Yeah.
It was just horrendous, really.
So how long did it take? How long did the clean-up operation take?
About a year.
Wow.
In total. Just skip loads of rubbish. And bear in mind, all the deep freezes in everybody's houses, we lost electricity, you couldn't get all the contents out. That by the time they got back, it was 3 months later, it was all rotting and stinking, or it upturned in the houses. So all of this had to be disposed of. All the silage, straw, hay had to be disposed of because it was rotting. So it was quite a task.
Yeah, it sounds absolutely dreadful.
And then we had to reseed. So insurance.
So you'd lost all the grass. That was all dead.
Everything had died.
Presumably, your soil health for in your other fields.
Massive compaction issues because there was 10,000 tonne of water an acre.
Yeah.
That had compacted the ground. So by compacting it that tight, there was no air in the soil, and the air had rotted. It was stinking. It was really horrible and dead. There was no worms in it, no bacteria.
Yeah.
So it's taken 5 years, or it took 5 years, to get the soil back to where it was before the flood.
And so there was a £20 million flooding action plan put in place as a result of the 2014 floods. What actions have you seen that have been taken so far?
Well, they've initially dredged the rivers after 2014, so that's good. They've started, you know, the river was silted 52%.
52%, wow.
And it's a man-made river, and it hadn't, as you said, hadn't been done for 25 years, or dredged. So it needed dredging back to where it was designed, because as a man-made river, it was designed to take the water away efficiently.
Yes.
When it's silted 52%, it clearly doesn't. And if it can't get through, it comes over onto the land. And then that's very inefficient because it has to be then pumped back into the river.
Yeah.
So there's a cost all round. So, you know, and when you flood this land, this is a carbon sink.
Yes.
So it absorbs carbon. We're on peak down over there. When it's underwater, it then releases carbon.
Yeah.
So you can't just flood ground willy-nilly, you know, in these days.
Yeah.
But the government have put the money in, and they're doing attenuation ponds upstream, slowing the water coming down.
Okay.
Putting hedges in, putting trees in. An attenuation pond is to slow the water from getting to us, because 20 years ago the water used to take 24 hours to come off of a hill. If you had a storm on a hill, it took 24 hours to get to us. Now it takes within 8 to 12 hours.
Wow.
So it's so quick.
Yeah.
So if we can slow that, that gives us a chance to get rid of the water down here. So that's a good thing. We're trying flood resilient grasses as well. So, you know, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So if we do have a flood, at least we haven't lost everything.
You can protect your grass.
Exactly. But as I learned through the whole process, you cannot have grass or anything underwater for more than 21 days, otherwise it will die. So 21 days is your crucial
window.
It's got to be off.
Yeah.
by then.
But really, the solution is the maintenance of the rivers, so that so we don't get into this situation again.
Yeah, but with global warming, our weather events are so much more severe. It's all or nothing. So, yes, we might have a flood, and I accept we might have a flood, but nowhere near to the scale. You know, where I'm stood here, the water was that deep.
Wow, that's unbelievable.
So it can either get to that stage again.
Yeah.
600 houses flooded, but there were 47,000 houses lower than us.
Yeah.
On the way out to sea that could quite easily have flooded.
Wow.
So, you know, it needs to be maintained.
Yeah. Yes. Well, thank you so much for talking to us, James. It sounds absolutely awful. I'm so sorry that you had to go through that, but thank you for sharing it with us. Okay, so now it's time for another review. What I'd like you to do now is to write down one of the causes, one of the impacts and one of the responses in regards to the Somerset flooding in 2014. But remember, when you're in the answers to these questions, it's really important to include as much place-specific information as you can.
So let's review. Can you list one cause, one impact and one response in relation to the Somerset Levels floods of 2014? We're going to put it up on the screen there. Just give you a little bit more time to think about that question. Okay. So for the causes, you could have mentioned the series of storms saturating the soil, the lack of dredging of the rivers Tone and Parrett, or the storm surges in the tidal parts of the rivers. Impacts could include 600 homes being flooded, farmers such as James having to move their livestock, or the damage to the habitats from the polluted water. And what about the responses? You could have focused on the immediate responses, such as James moving his family to temporary accommodation, or on the long-term responses, such as the Flood Action Plan. Remember, the more place-specific information you can include, the better. So does vegetation cover really make a big difference to the flood risk in an area? We'd love you to examine this further by completing the extension investigation that you can find on the lesson page. It's up on your screen there as well. Right, the great news is that we're now joined by James, who's going to answer some more of your questions. So good morning, James. How are you doing? Fantastic. We've got some great questions coming in for you. The first question that I'd like to ask is, you mentioned the floodwater being toxic. Why was the water toxic?
Because on the way down from the hills, 2 sewage farms flooded, the village flooded, so all the septic tanks from the village, diesel tanks, farm diesel tanks, heating oil tanks all flooded there, bunded tanks, so basically full of air, and they are around the outside of the diesel just to stop any spillage, but they float. So they floated off, and as they floated off, they ruptured the pipes and flooded.
Gosh, so yeah, that sounds like a rather nasty cocktail going on there, coming down right towards where you lived. And you can see what an effect that's had on your property, on your farm, and the surrounding area as well. Obviously, it wasn't just you who were affected, but the 600 other homes as well that got that nasty mix going in there. We'll go back to a bit more of a farming-related question. I asked this to Henry earlier, and I'd like to ask you as well. How do you see these extreme weather events and climate change affecting your farming practices in the future?
Quite considerably, really. The weather isn't as we used to have it. It's very sharp, heavy rainfall. The problem we're having also is a lot of building upstream, so above us, and lots of houses going in. So the runoff is that much greater and quicker. So as I said before, it used to take 24 hours for water to get down to us from the surrounding hills and the surrounding towns. And now it's within 8 hours. So the system hasn't been or wasn't designed to take that amount of water. And it was, as I said, it's a man-made system. So it needs upgrading, it needs maintenance. And as an EA report came out after the floods. 9 out of 10 properties wouldn't have flooded if the river had been maintained. So that's quite key. And we set up a charity after the floods in Somerset called Forage Aid, and we go all over the country helping other farmers in the same sort of predicament. And it's come to fruition. A lot of it is lack of maintenance. We do grow cover crops, and we do direct drill, and soil health is key. But at the end of the day, we're at the bottom of the hill, so we have everybody's water. So whatever we do, still, it helps, but it's not the answer. The answer is doing maintenance and slowing the flow from the hills.
Fantastic. Yeah, you've almost just answered the next question I was going to ask you, which was going to be how you're mitigating the effects of climate change as well as a farmer. You've already mentioned things like cover crops and direct drilling. Is there anything else you're doing as a farmer to mitigate carbon emissions on your farm?
Yeah, we use, as we said, flood resilient grasses now. We've been trialling good soil health, so good bacteria in the soil and good worm health. So that will absorb more carbon if you've got good soils working. So that's a good tick. We maintain all the water courses on the farm. And the drainage board maintain a lot of other water courses so the water can get to the drainage pumps to pump any water that comes on the moors back into the river.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, James, and for sharing your story as well with our audience. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. So how are flooding and farming interrelated? How are farms affected by flooding, and how can farmers minimise the future flood risk in vulnerable places? The Environment Agency plays an important role in flood management, but the government directs them to prioritise flood management in residential areas, not farms. For every £1 of flood damage avoided, the Environment Agency can only use 5p to protect farms, businesses and infrastructure, but they can use 48p to protect homes. People such as farmers who own land next to rivers are known as riparian owners and are responsible for maintaining the river's beds and banks and for managing the flood risk. In reality though, farmers and the Environment Agency often work together with other stakeholders in the countryside to build resilience and minimise flood risk. So, what might a question on flooding look like in your future exams? Here's one example. For an extreme weather event, you have studied, discussed the response of 2 or more groups of people to the event, and that would be worth something around 6 marks. Okay, so to answer this question, you need to think of at least 2 groups of people and how they responded to an extreme weather event. You could use the extreme weather event which led to the Somerset levels flooding in 2014. And what you could do is look at the response of the farmers, such as James Winslade, and also the Environment Agency. You'll need to make a well-developed point about the response of each group, including place-specific detail. Why not have a go at answering this question after the lesson? And that brings us to the end of the lesson today. I'd like to thank everybody who's been involved, so Henry, Catherine, and James for sharing their stories with us, telling us about what they do. Also a big shout out to Catherine Owen who helped us with the content of this lesson, and all the team here as well who've brought it together. Please do log back into our 2 future lessons that are happening this week. We're going to be looking at the results of our biodiversity study that we did yesterday tomorrow with Ed Tate and Lewis over at the Isle. And on Thursday I already mentioned the lesson we're running around the carbon cycle and farming, and I know a lot of you have got questions about this, so we're really keen for you to log in and have a look and get asking our experts some questions. We've got some great people there. Thanks everybody for watching, and we'll catch you soon.